Soon weed is going to be legal in Canada, and today we're talking about whether it's addictive, whether it's a gateway drug, and whether or not you should try it. That's coming right up. So today I'm here with my good friend Pete VanVolkingbugh. We grew up together, we went to youth group and junior high together. And Pete, why don't you tell them a little bit about what it is you studied?
So for the last 3 years, I've been working on my master's in counseling, studying all kinds of things related to psychology and counseling, but with a concentration in addictions.
So today we're talking about weed, which is soon becoming legal. And when we were growing up in youth group, kind of the story that we got around weed was don't do it because it's illegal.
Right.
Now, if you remove that barrier, how is it that we should be having this conversation with students?
Well, I think the first thing that's important to notice is that weed hasn't really been studied that long. Because it's been illegal, because it's been outlawed, it's not been a substance that people have been able to work with clinically. So we don't really know everything that it does.
You're having a conversation with them, or I am, or another youth worker, and they say, should I try weed? Is there any real danger? What do you say?
There is real risk specifically to developing brains. Most people don't know that brains develop into the late 20s. And the part of your brain that is developed last is actually the part that processes marijuana and THC and CBD and the psychoactive components to marijuana. That your brain will not develop the same way, that your impulse control will be impacted, that there is a real possibility of brain structures not becoming what they're supposed to just because of the cannabis use.
So it poses like a serious health risk.
Yeah.
For especially younger people, I'm hearing?
Absolutely. For anyone under the age of 30, your brain is still under construction. The research is showing loss of IQ points. It's showing a potential onset of psychosis and schizophrenia. It's not worth the risk because of the potential danger.
And what about the 40-year-old, 50-year-old, always been curious,
Right.
Never done it? Are there risks for them?
Realistically, we just don't know enough about what weed does to you. We haven't studied it broadly enough or consistently enough over the years to be able to prove conclusively that it is safe. Anyone that tells you differently hasn't done a legitimate research on weed.
Right, and we hear that all the time on
Absolutely.
like social media for sure, Facebook, infographics. Yep. There's lots of stuff that says there's no risk at all.
That's right. And as we study it medically, it may be that we come out with legitimate medical uses for the drug.
Sure.
That's not a bad thing. But just like other drugs, like morphine,
right.
We understand that there's a place for it. When I break my leg, I need to use morphine. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a wise thing or a safe thing for me to use daily.
Right. It gets you high, but the intention is to help you heal properly.
That's right.
Versus if you were just using morphine recreationally.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the category that we're putting weed into
That's
here.
right.
It's not that medicinal use, but it's just recreational.
Right.
And it's potentially harmful to your body without the positive side effect.
Yeah.
So something that is said super confidently, you see it on social media, you even sometimes see it on the news, is that weed isn't dangerous because it's not addictive.
Right.
So what is an addiction, and can weed be addictive?
Right. So an addiction is anything, either a chemical or a behavior that actually dominates your life. It's something that comes in and takes control. We see it very obviously in cocaine and heroin addiction, alcohol addiction, but we also see it in a much more subtle form in other behaviors like gambling, like eating disorders, along those lines as well.
Which isn't necessarily a chemical that your brain is addicted to,
Exactly.
But the behavior is something that you're becoming addicted to.
That's
and
right.
weed poses a risk for that.
Yeah, so weed will have some addictive qualities to it just because it is changing brain chemistry. But the withdrawal symptoms that come from it are generally going to be more associated with the behavior than the drug. Typically with weed culture, people associate not just their use, but the rest of their lives with the drug. So if we've been around a group of high school students that tend to smoke a lot of weed, they find friends, they choose music, they choose clothes based on who uses the drug. And so just like alcohol, we wouldn't think it was a healthy thing for someone to plan their whole lives around being drunk or plan their whole lives around beer or wine. The same is true with the weed, that we're not going to think that it's a healthy thing for someone to plan their entire day and their whole social circle around the drug.
So kind of an old debate that we grew up with was that if you smoke weed, then pretty soon you're going to be on to harder drugs.
Right.
So is weed actually a really dangerous gateway drug or not?
Well, I think to say that it's going to turn into going from smoking weed to doing heroin is an exaggeration. But why they talk about it as a gateway drug is because typically it is someone's first experience with drugs. And if somebody is using drugs as a coping mechanism, weed as their coping for their hard life, their hard day, or their stress, then there is a real risk that when the weed does not hit as strongly as it used to, when tolerance develops, something stronger will be sought after by the user.
So I'm really interested to know what's the impact on the state of mind with one glass of wine versus one joint.
So with a glass of wine, the intent behind that is not necessarily to get drunk. We know there's alcohol in there, and if we drink a bottle of wine, there's going to be intoxication. But with a glass of wine at dinner after a long day of work, the chances are good that there's going to be little to no impact on state of mind or cognitive ability. When we get to smoking a joint, the intent behind that is very rarely just to get the flavor or to just enjoy a joint with your meal. It's to actually get the effects and the change of your mental state. And so it comes down to the intention behind each, but it's a lot more significant impairment with a joint than it is for one glass of wine.
Pete, to summarize, you're saying we don't know a lot about weed.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying it's definitely a danger to young minds as they're developing.
Yeah.
And also just this question of if you're needing this drug to escape, there's kind of a deeper question about what's going on in your heart that you're needing this drug.
Yeah.
But my question for you, we both studied theology, is kind of how do we approach this subject from a Christian worldview?
Right. Well, I think one of the things that hangs people up is that alcohol is warned against in the Bible.
Sure.
But it doesn't elaborate into necessarily specifically into drugs. But I think that we're given principles that can very clearly give us an answer.
Right.
When Paul tells us to be sober-minded and alert,
Mm-hmm.
That's the opposite of being stoned. That's the
Right.
opposite of being high.
Right.
And so when we look at it from a biblical perspective and say, should I do this, should I not do this? And we have these principles called to be filled by the Spirit. Do not get drunk with wine, but be filled by the Spirit. Those principles apply specifically to weed as well. And I think that Scripture gives us a very clear indication to stay away from anything that's going to take away from our alertness.
Right. It tells us to be self-controlled.
Absolutely.
And your mind is a valuable gift from God, and so is your body.
Yeah.
Those things are sacred, and we should be protecting those.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much, Pete, for taking the time
Thanks
to
for
do this.
having me.
If you have any other questions about all this, Pete would love to answer that. Please leave your questions below. We'll get Pete on Skype or FaceTime or whatever, and we'll ask him those questions so we can continue this discussion and continue to make a positive impact in youth culture and continue discussing what matters. I'll see you next Tuesday.